Well, as Chris said, oh, she's loud, I talk loud. I was doing a project on horse injury during floating, so that covers horses who are injured during motor vehicle accidents, but also horses who are injured during an otherwise uneventful trip. Something that's pretty close to most horse owners' hearts, that they worry about their horses being injured. There's a lot of anecdotal information as to what constitutes safe floating practice and what doesn't. And most people who've been around horse people realise that they have firm opinions one way or another on the topic. However, there's been very little data that's been available which is objective. A lot of the safe float design, for example, is based on a manufacturer's perspective, which is not necessarily unbiased. So as Chris mentioned, there's actually quite a bit of information that's been published so far, particularly in Europe and the USA, on covering a bit more so on the commercial side of transport, so things like stocking density, provision of water, resting periods on long journeys. That's not necessarily covers the scope of what's needed in the, I guess, the non-commercial transport, so that's what we're particularly focusing on here. If you talk with owners, trailer design is actually probably a big concern for them, as Rebecca said, angles versus straight versus rear facing versus forward facing. There's a number of studies published there looking at different orientations in trailers, and to be honest, most researchers have been able to skew it towards their own preference, so there's conflicting studies for either or. But there's actually really little focus on driver behaviour. As you know, in Australia, you can get your Ps, you can hook up a float and start driving without actually having to do any training as a driver of horses, and I think probably a lot of inexperienced drivers of horses are quite worried about doing it, and a lot of accidents are probably, at least have been admitted to as a result of this study, due to inexperience. So what we're looking to do in this study is to answer a few questions. So the first of those is, what is the frequency of injuries to horses associated with transport? There's very little statistics or information kept on this. We have no knowledge of actually how many horses are transported daily, how often people are transporting horses, and what equipment they're using to transport them, let alone what training they have and their experiences as drivers. We were particularly looking at what factors are associated with the risk of injury. This is what the horse owners are concerned about, because if we know what our risk factors are, we can try to mitigate those risks and provide some information to the public as to how to decrease rates of injury to horses during transport. And as I said, the whole idea is the prevention of injury to horses from a non-biased viewpoint. So what we did, we conducted surveys of floats or trucks, mainly light, medium rigids for the trucks, because this is a non-commercial survey, and we looked at a number of events in South Australia and also Victoria. So most of these were horse events where the horses were actually attending, so things like the Royal Show, local pony club events, some roping events, endurance events. We tried to capture a bit of a broad scope where we'd have like people who were just driving locally versus people who were driving from interstate to actually attend these events. So the study was designed as an extended questionnaire, which was a personal interview. So it took probably about 15 minutes to do, which some people were really good at with giving us that information. Other people, you were trying to hold them there to get the rest of it. We didn't identify the respondents just so that we would avoid having to have ethics approval from the university to do that. So what we were specifically looking at was the driver demographics and their training and, I guess, their behaviour, what they did with their floating practice. Were they have any formal check of their floats or vehicles prior to hitching up and driving off? Looking at what the towing vehicle and float characteristics were, so were they towing a rated vehicle or not? A lot of people had no idea what their vehicles were rated to tow, let alone what the weight of their trailers would be if they actually had a horse on board. What a lot of people don't realise is if a horse trailer is 2,000 kilos, for example, a vehicle that's rated as 2,000 kilos for towing capacity, apart from that being an only manufacturer's rating, actually does not adjust for a kinetic load. Obviously, most of the recommendations are based on a static load, such as a trailer with, I don't know, bricks or wood that doesn't move. at the point of impact. Obviously, horses move, you put more impact on the tow ball at the time. So there's a lot of people who didn't know what that was and were towing, 2 horses with a towing rating of 1,500 kilos, which after talking with them, often they realise that that's probably not an appropriate thing to do. So, yeah, it was quite interesting to see what people's perceptions of safe practice were. And most of them, to be honest, were innocent enough mistakes. They weren't intending to do poor practice, but it could be quite risky down the track. We had a lot of, quite a few survey questions, so there's no simple way of modelling this data. I'm only part way through doing that. I was intending to finish by November this year. However, I had a small person earlier this year that's put my schedule back a little bit. So I will be hoping to finish writing this up by mid next year. So we are, as I said, we're talking about preliminary results. We collected the data at 11 events, and that was between September last year and January this year. And we collected 223 surveys, which we would have ideally liked to capture more, but time constraints were a bit difficult. Obviously, all those events are on weekends and 15 minutes per survey. You do the math, log that with them when I was on call as well, and I didn't have much time apart from that. So we got 193 floats and 30 trucks, and most of them were South Australian. We did capture some from interstate. We attended Equitana and had some surveys over there, and also we did obviously survey some Victorian and other interstate people, like the Adelaide show, for example. And as I said, we did look at a range of horse disciplines, just to try to get a little bit of a sample of everything. So of the people that we surveyed, we were actually specifically surveying the driver of the vehicle on the day of the event. Most of those were female. There was a few male, and there was 2 who weren't sure, so I'm not quite sure what to make of that. We had quite a range of drivers in their ages and also their towing experience, anywhere from actually being their first day to towing to people who'd been towing for 50 or so years. So I was actually interested to see just how many people had reasonable experience with towing. And the average trip was 50 trips per year, which I thought was quite high, but we were capturing people who were transporting the horses daily, but we obviously did have people that were once a year or quite infrequently. So with the results, it was interesting that there was no difference between rate of injury for horses going in a truck versus being in a float. But a reasonably high percentage, 23%, had recorded that a horse had been injured while they were driving, so I thought that was quite high. Most of those injuries were within the last 5 to 6 years. We did have a range of questions, but I think it's important that we are sampling reasonably recent data, and there seemed to be 2 peaks in this data where there was a large peak at 2 to 3 years and a large peak at 15 to 20 years since the injury. And there was no significant difference noticed for risk of accidents when we're looking at age or gender, which the ladies will probably be happy about, or the frequency of trips. So obviously driving more regularly doesn't negate you from having accidents with horses on board. So when we look at a spread of the factors contributing to their injuries, horse-associated or factors, and this is as described by the owners, so we must acknowledge some bias as to we're asking for their interpretation of what occurred. Just around 73% were horse-associated. Only 6.4% admitted that there might be some driver error involved. I probably suspect that would be higher, but that's all we can, I guess, take from that. And then we've got mechanical failure, so mostly that was due to I think, float problems, so things breaking, rather than, I don't think there was many vehicles, mechanical failures per se. But as I said, it was far and above the horse-associated ones, and scrambling was probably at the top of the list as the reasons why the horses were injured. So when we're looking at the driver-associated factors, people who admitted to answering the phone while driving were definitely more likely to have an accident. I guess when we're looking at the survey data, we were surveying on the day of the accident. There was a lot of questions that were referring directly to the day, of the event, and then we were looking at accidents separately. So there was no one who had an accident, I don't think, on the day of the event, because I'm assuming most people who injure their horses probably don't continue on to the event. So this is probably more of a predictor of if they are likely to do one thing in the past, they're probably more likely to do that in the future. The longer the distance they travel to the event, the more likely they are to have injuries with horses. Driving between rest breaks, The longer that period, the more likely people were to have had an accident with or an injury with a horse, and less sleep within the last 24 hours prior to the survey. You know, at the Royal Show, there was people who'd had 2 or 3 hours sleep, and then we also had questions about 48 hours previously as well. But people who were more likely to be sleep deprived were more likely to have had accidents, and as I said, that's probably a predictor of their behaviour in general when they transport horses rather than on that specific event. So the causes of the injuries, as I said, scrambling was a really big one for people, often when cornering or on a curve, and to be honest, that's probably going to be a driver-associated thing, whether they're actually not approaching at a correct speed or overcompensating. Slipping on the flooring, so flooring I think was probably quite a big factor in the way that the flooring was designed, as well as combined with the driver behaviour. Horses panicking. And loading and unloading, as Rebecca said, often causes a lot of problems for people. People put a lot of pressure on horses to get them in the floats, and then they're anxious when they get in there, trying to race out backwards. And then again, injury to horses during horse-to-horse conflict, so horses being bitten or going under rails, but the other one not being able to get away is probably an important factor there. With the mechanical failure of the floats, rotten flooring, so we ask questions of how often people check floats. Some people don't check them ever really. Most people weren't checking the flooring itself. They might have a visual inspection of the float in general, but a lot of people don't look under the rubber to see what the flooring condition is like. Hitch point snapping, you probably think most people would have a bit of a look at their hitch because they touch it every time they load the float up, but there were a number of hitch problems. And suspension failure, where the spring's actually broken and the float overturned. With a traffic relation, most people who had a traffic-related issue said that it was because they had to brake suddenly. Again, probably defensive driving on their part wasn't exercised necessarily as well as it could have. Some of those incidents would have been unavoidable due to other driver behaviour. And as I said earlier, insufficient tow rating of vehicles makes it a little bit hard to stop sometimes. And yeah, make sure you don't tie your horse's head when you're unloading. So this is a little distribution of where the injury locations were. We actually provided this diagram to people in the survey so they could actually indicate clearly where the horses were being injured. About a third of them were in the hind limbs, with flanks and the hind as well also being quite a lot, as well as the front legs and the head, which makes sense. I guess that would speak to whether people are putting leg protection on their horses. I would probably say that that would support putting leg protection on. People are concerned that the horses will overheat with leg protection. I think they've got plenty of other major veins through which they can lose heat, that the high incidence of damage to lower legs probably supports them putting on leg protection, so that's just an aside. So we just also had a quick look at the time when injuries were occurring. So this graph is a little bit slanted, but if you look at it, most of the injuries to horses are actually occurring in the morning. So when people are, I guess, transporting horses to events, whether they're overtired or in a hurry, I guess I can't speak to that fully. And most of them were also occurring during movement. So we did ask them questions as to whether it happened when they were moving, stationary, loading and unloading as well. So that's just of interest. So I've still got a little bit more work to do with the data modelling, and we will be publishing the findings. After we've done that, I'll do an online version of the survey. Obviously this is a reasonably broad survey because there has been little work done in this field, and the main aim of this survey has been to highlight areas where we might do some further work. So I'm probably interested in looking at flooring surfaces and also causes of scrambling. As I said, I think that's probably, given that this is where a lot of the injuries are actually occurring to horses, looking a little bit more closely at that would probably be of benefit. But as I said, the main aim of this is to provide some information for the public so that we can actually decrease the risk of horses being injured. And so I'd just like to acknowledge that, that I was sponsored by the Horse SA and the Industry Council, and that's much appreciated. And I'll take some questions if I've got half a minute.